I'm going to begin with no introduction, because certainly Mike Pompeo does not need an introduction. My old friend Henry Kissinger used to say, those who need no introduction usually crave them the most. But I'm going to assume that that is not true. Mr. Pompeo is, of course, the former Secretary of State of the United States, former CIA director, and unusually a kind of rare bird, one would say, in the Republican Party, somebody who says that to be an America firster is to be in favor of Ukraine. So that is not how most people think of the America First movement, Mike. That's not how a lot of the people who claim to be America Firsters would describe the situation. Why do you say to be an America Firster is to be pro-Ukraine?
Well, first of all, thanks, Fareed. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you all for joining me. Look, America First became the shorthand for the model that we adopted, that President Trump led, and we tried to execute alongside of him. And sometimes it may well have been our own fault. Happy to take some share of the responsibility for that. But it was never about a narrow vision of what that meant. It was never about focus back home, do only things at home, don't think about the world. I think it's fair that if you look at the 4-year sweep of President Trump's actual delivered policies, put aside messaging and the like, if you look at the actual delivered policies, it was very clear that we were mindful that you had to deliver powerful economic outcomes for America, powerful security outcomes for America. But in order to achieve each of those, you needed to have deep connectivity, build out partnerships, relationships, strategic conversations with those who could help us achieve that in a way that actually delivered for America first. And I think with respect to Europe and to Ukraine, from my perspective, that's certainly the case. It's true. I'm sure we'll talk about this. There are people in my party who have a different judgment on that, about what that means. But I for one, and I think for our time that we were in government, I think what we actually executed demonstrated that commitment to NATO and to Europe and to Ukrainian support in ways that are not fully appreciated and talked about. And that's okay. What I really care about is outcomes. It's not about credit. But for me, you can't get it right for American security without a Ukrainian victory and a strong Europe and a great partnership as between the United States and Europe and NATO.
So, as you say, there are people in the party who clearly have a different view. What's in the news right now is J.D. Vance's peace plan. And I don't know whether he realized or not, but his peace plan is pretty close to Putin's peace plan. I mean, basically, a peace plan that ratifies all Russian conquest, that promises that Ukraine will no longer seek NATO membership, even suggests it might not even suggest ask for European Union membership, because he has a vague phrase where he says other alliances like that. Now that's very different from the peace plan you've put forward, which is, I would say, a much more realistic, but one that really tries to recognize Ukraine's legitimate equities in all this. He's the vice presidential nominee. Are you going to have a big debate with him if you guys win?
I am confident that we collectively, not necessarily just as between he and I, but there will be this tussle will definitely take place. One thing we do share in common is that we have both now come out with an articulation of how we think it ought to go forward. Neither of us is going to be president. And in the end, this will be decided by the president, whether that's President Harris or President Trump. Look, I think the vision that some in our party have laid out misses the mark. I think they fundamentally misunderstand America's fundamental interests, and that's where this conversation should take place. I will give them one piece of it's not excuse, but explanatory matter. I remember vividly. I was a member of Congress. President Obama indicated if the Assad regime used chemical weapons, he was going to strike them. I was on the House Intelligence Committee. None of you knew who I was. I was a backbench member of Congress. There were exactly 8 Republicans that put out a statement supporting President Obama, saying, if they use chemical weapons, we support American use to enforce the red line that he had laid out. It was actually the first time I met President Biden. We were all called to the Situation Room. Vice President Biden met with us and said, how do we get the rest of your colleagues to do that? And I said, no, you're just, pray, sir. I got no better answer. It was hard. I got crushed back home. Not because of the policy as directly, but because I was supporting Barack Obama. And so for some, and perhaps Senator Vance and others fit into this, for some it is difficult when they view the Biden administration as have not gotten the execution of this right, of having failed on deterrence, having then delivered weaponry too slow, and all the other critiques that I have consistently made as well. The risk that the resources don't all go to the right places, all of those risks cumulatively, I think for some make it difficult to go back to their constituents, wherever they may be, and articulate why this still matters. I actually don't think it's that hard, but for some who aren't following this as closely or who are operating, on the Ag Committee or someplace else, I think it's when it's the president from the other party you find this more often, and I suspect some of the critique of what President Trump did from the Democrats stem from this same U.S. domestic political conundrum. I think on national security you should throw that all away, but not every elected official does that.
Talk a little bit about your peace plan. So people, for those who aren't aware, what are the contours? What do you think is the most important thing?
Oh, goodness. Look, Fareed, probably the most important thing I talked about yesterday, there has to be a substantive victory for Ukraine and for Europe and for the West, as well as the perception of Russian defeat. That is a geostrategic imperative, so it matters in other theaters outside of Europe as well. Certainly, not just we talk about China and we talk about Iran, it certainly matters in those theaters as well, but it matters in the economic realm as well. It has to be the case that the world accepts that the good guys all came together in very tough circumstances and pushed back against unlawful aggression in the way that Putin has terrorized Ukraine. As for the pieces of it, it says the article is a little elliptical about this, but it talks about a path to NATO. It talks clearly about the central idea of Ukraine's recognition of its own territory, its sovereign territory. I issued the Crimea Declaration back in the day, too often forgotten from what we did in the Trump administration. And then it acknowledges that the economic relationships that need to be developed as between Ukraine and Europe are imperative with a path to move to the EU, and hopefully more rapidly than that typically happens.
There's a piece of this, and you appreciate this as a former Secretary of State, there's a debate about whether it should be NATO membership or a security guarantee provided by key NATO members. Do you have a view on one or the other?
I do. I have a strong preference for NATO membership, but I would say that if it's for whatever reason, and NATO is a complicated organizational structure as well. Anybody who's ever dealt with them, just like people say Europe, and it sounds easy, and then you go to each of the 20-some capitals, and it gets complicated really quickly. If that's just not achievable, and there are the other pillars of the solution are available, then there are other models, right? Today, the United States has security guarantee with Japan, has security guarantees with the Philippines, right? So there are other models that one could adopt that I think would achieve what is really important, which is ensuring that we get another, I don't pick a time, 25 years, however long one can imagine, where the Ukrainian people don't have to risk this, nor do any of the other border nations in Europe have to risk Russian aggression in the way that we saw, frankly, and I try not to do politics, the way that we saw in Georgia, right? So this is a historical pattern that we have to break, and I think a security guarantee, preferably in NATO, but if not possible outside of it, that is sufficient and rigorous and backed with real stuff, not just a piece of paper, but an actual security guarantee that is physical on the ground and material.
So let me talk a little bit about your time in the Trump administration, because you have actual knowledge of the situation and working with for example, the Ukrainian government. J.D. Vance has said several times that the Ukrainian government is the most corrupt government in the world. In your dealings with Ukraine, what was your impression?
You know, my boss suffered an impeachment because of a phone call with Ukrainians that we suffered for an awfully long time. And when I say suffered, I don't mean like tortured. I mean, it was difficult for us to work this problem set with Russia and Ukraine. It was actually, it's a fun story. I actually found President Zelensky at a ceremony at the UN in September to tell him that we were about to release the near transcript of that phone call. I took him out of a lunch, I grabbed him from the table. It was really quite something. There were several thousand people in the room, and everybody's like, what's going on? So we have a deep set of relationships, yes. Look, my experience was that when the Ukrainian leadership promised something that they were going to do, they did it. We all know the history of the system here. The risk of corruption in Ukraine is real. It's not unique to Ukraine. You know, we've got to make sure we get our house in order too before we throw a whole lot of stones. But yeah, you've got to get that right. And as I've now transitioned to the private sector and I'm trying to help Ukraine get it right economically in the aftermath of this conflict, Ukraine's going to have to make sure they have a judicial system that is sufficient, right? So property rights can be enforced, so Western capital will flow, European capital will come. You've got to have confidence in that. And so the corruption must be not only stamped out, but the process has to be sufficiently transparent that you can restore the Ukrainian economy. But my experience with the Ukrainian leadership, in spite of all the noise that we had, that was, I mean, we had these impeachment hearings. You had State Department officials testifying against the administration. It was really quite something. And by the way, that made it hard for Ukrainian leadership too to figure out how to get a foothold with us as well.
One of the things that people do wonder about, you mentioned the impeachment. What is Trump's attitude towards Ukraine, towards Zelensky? You've heard him many times, and there are a lot of people who feel like he seems like he doesn't like Ukraine, he doesn't like Zelensky. What's the reality?
Oh, I try not to sort of talk about that, but I'll say this. My experience with President Trump, for not in this case in particular, but more broadly, is he's a practitioner's practitioner. He is deeply pragmatic and practical, and the world of the possible is at the forefront. I remember I was the CI director probably about 6 months in, and he kicks everybody. I briefed him one day, and he kicked everybody out, and he says, Mike, you always show up talking about guns and missiles and stuff. Who's got the money? Right? Look, he's a New York real estate guy, right? And by the way,
and you said Saudi Arabia, and that's why he went there.
But his point was these solutions are often economic, right? And we sometimes in the security world, me included, forget that in the end, the driver of security is often the capacity for capital to be used to make the lives better of nations. And so I actually thought it was a good admonition. The CIA didn't do as good a job as it should have talking about the economic piece of the intelligence analysis that needed to be done. And I hope we've collectively all got that better, because when the president thinks about Ukraine, he thinks, how do we integrate them in an economic model that delivers for them and is good for the United States of America as well? And so I think if you said, what's his view of Ukraine? He's like, yeah, no, I got it. There's lots of opportunity. They got great resources, natural resources. They got enormous human capital. Let's figure out a way to, Mike, get the trade representative in. Let's figure this out, right? That's not unique to Ukraine, but true for most of the relationships that he had with world leaders across the board, both our allies and and those that fall on the other side. We'll call them whatever.
You've, as one can tell, you've maintained a fairly good relationship with President Trump, and you are very supportive of him, which makes you a small minority among the former cabinet ministers he has. I think 14 of the 19 members of his cabinet now denounce him. His vice president says he's a threat to the country.
It's a very unique club. Yes, exactly.
Your predecessor calls him a effing moron. The former chief of staff doesn't support him. 2 former national security advisors don't support him. What do you see in him that they don't?
Yeah. So, no, that's a good question. That's a very fair question. I observed a leader who one could work with and through and for, that could deliver on the outcomes, the things that I believed made sense. It is not the case remotely that I won every debate with President Trump, or frankly that anybody else did. But I watched him navigate through incredibly complicated situations, including the fact that then he was impeached a second time. We had the entire world, including the network you work for Reed, torching him every day. I would travel the world and I would turn on CNN International. It was a world which I did not know. And then you separate out the noise, right? His Twitter account from the reality of the things we did. And I was all in for the outcomes we got. And I please don't take this politically. I think if you stare at the situation in Ukraine today and ask, is it better here today than it was when we were there? I just think it's undoubtedly the case. And I know many of you will say, well, you were just lucky. Great. Happy to take credit for the good Lord smiling on us. I happen to think that wasn't the case. I happen to think that Putin understood our deterrence model in a way that was successful. The President said in the debate the other night this wouldn't have happened. I use different language because I try to avoid saying things that I can't prove, that are counterfactual. What I can say for sure, Fareed, is it didn't happen, right? Putin took a fifth of Ukraine when President Obama was in office. He took 0% when we were there, and then he went back at it. Everybody can then lay over the top of that their theory of the case of why that is. I happen to believe, and this is to your point about these others, I happen to believe it's because we understood the effective use of power to achieve deterrence. And some of them got frustrated because he didn't do it their way.
But it's more than just.
By the way, sometimes I've seen the president call some of us morons. It's okay. It's a big boy stuff, so get after it.
But some of it isn't just style. It's a matter of character.
Sure.
And you're a person of very high integrity.
Yeah.
You graduated top of your class at West Point, and I think of West Point as still a place that is not just about intelligence, but about instilling a sense of character and integrity. Why does it not trouble you, some of the things that troubled so many of the other people who were served with him in high office?
So they do blur. I agree. These issues of character and integrity and all that, they do blur. I'll concede that. You've read more history than I have, Fareed. If you go look at American leaders over the sweep of the 250 years, we've had some. It's absolutely fascinating to see who these people were, whether it's Lyndon Johnson or. We don't elect pastors to be our presidents very often in the United States of America. And so in the role that I had, which was to execute on behalf of the American people, President Trump's mission, try and keep our kids from having to go fight and die someplace and deliver good diplomatic outcomes, I have a high tolerance for the other things that I separated out. And maybe this gets to your previous question as well. I would get it. I'd go on NBC with Chuck Todd and he'd say, Mr. Secretary, this week the president tweeted, my button's bigger than your button. And there'd be the chyron. And I'd say, Chuck, let me tell you what we're doing in North Korea. And he'd give me 2 minutes. This is the model, right? And then he'd say, but the tweet. And I'd say, I want to remind you what we did this week. I was able to try to separate that noise from the signal, and the mission for me, at least, the mission was too important to let the noise interrupt my work. I totally got it, right? I was the 70th Secretary of State. He's the 45th president. There was more turnover in my gig than his. I seriously, I would check my phone every morning, go to his Twitter account, not fired, go to work. It became quite the ritual in the Pompeo home. At first, my wife laughed, and then she's like, "Trust me, someone else will have called you. You'll know." And so you work. I guess that's the best answer I have, Fareed. And you recognize you're not him. He's not you. You have a mission. He's doing his thing. I'm going to try and deliver on the task that he's put before me.
So let's talk about some of the substantive issues you'd face in these debates. There are people like Bridge Colby, whom I'm sure you know and respect, who say Pompeo has it all wrong. We should be abandoned. I don't think he'd use the words abandoned, but we should give up on the Ukraine cause. The real fight is China. We should worry much more about deterring Beijing and Taiwan. And that's why I think he's essentially embraced the Vance peace plan. Yeah. Why do you think that view is wrong as somebody who's been historically very tough on China?
Two pieces to that. One, it's just unrealistic. So as a practitioner, you can't contemplate the task, which I concede Colby has right, and we didn't do enough, but we got to a better place. The recognition that the Chinese Communist Party does present this next generational risk to the Western order, to all of us who care about human dignity and property rights. So he's right about that. You can't get that right without partners and a strong Europe. I would say the same thing about Japan and Australia and South Korea and, frankly, our Gulf state partners as well. So I think he misunderstands that. His answer is, nope, let Europe do it, right? By the way, sign me up for Europe doing more. I hope no one will take offense, but if you're from Germany or France, please get serious about securing your own nation, right? I was a young soldier that patrolled the then East German border 100 million years ago, in 1986 to 1989. You know, I'd go to the bars in Nuremberg and wonder, like, why I was out there working so hard and the kids were there drinking. It is an imperative that Europe not use the moment.
And in those days, Germany had 1 million men under arms.
No, they did. They did. And by the way, they were good partners in the Fulda Gap, and then in our section of South, they were great partners. But I just urge, one of my big concerns, and I think Colby Bridge would share this view, is when this is over, Europe will revert to norm, right? Sell more Volkswagens to China, right? Go back and take gas from the Russians. Please don't let that happen. It is an imperative that we recognize this as something that is ongoing, continuous, and necessary. And Europe, broadly speaking, not just the Poles and the folks who are on the front lines, but in the Baltic states and but Europe is going to have to do more. And so I applaud that. President Trump famously, went after this in ways I would have probably used language that was different. But pretty effective, as Secretary Stoltenberg would say, with respect to NATO. And then the other thing that I think Bridge misses on this is, for good or for bad, American leadership matters every place in the world. Sometimes that's hard to tell the American public, to explain that to them. But I saw this, I knew it, but I saw this even more plainly when I was in service for those 4 years. There's no substitute for the United States. And that is an enormous burden for us. It's a burden to the taxpayers, it's a burden to our military. All of that is true. The benefits that redound to us far exceed that cost. And I think that's what sometimes the bridges of the world miss. Those things that accrue to our benefit. The economic benefits, the fact that the dollar is still the global reserve currency, the fact that, if you're a student in you're going to college and you're in Africa and you're thinking, where do I want to go to college? You're not going to go to Beijing. That's not going to be your first choice. At least you're unlikely to attend the University of Moscow, unless it's in Idaho, right? Moscow, Idaho. For those of you who aren't tracking closely, there's a Moscow, Idaho. You want to go to Kansas State. You want to go to Berkeley. I would suggest aim higher, but okay.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah. So I think that's what they missed. They missed the second piece of that too. That is the benefit side of American leadership.
That you put that very eloquently, and I think that a lot of people have this fundamental question: does Donald Trump get that?
Yeah.
Because he's so often, when he talks about the world, everyone's ripping us off. We don't get any benefit from this. Our allies rip us off. Why do we pay for security? Why do we?
Yeah.
The trade is a one-way street. We're always the suckers. Do you think he gets what you just said?
I do. By the way, sometimes we have been suckers. So it's important, I think, with President Trump to recognize a lot of times he does get to central truths, right? We allowed the Chinese Communist Party steal our stuff for 40 years, and we just turned the other cheek and told Wall Street, go make money there. That was not a good model for American, and I would argue European economic strength in the decades that are in front of us. It's a bit theatrical for me sometimes, and can cause others to perceive what he says in a different way. But I do think he at his core gets that, and with a couple of minor exceptions, every time we confronted that issue in a big way, think of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi. In the end, and we got him there pretty quickly on this one. I wrote 2 tweets. One of them was the post-Khashoggi tweet. By the way, if you look at it, you'd think he wrote it. It was brilliant. I captured his voice absolutely perfectly. We understood that, okay, suck it up. This is bad. We're going to get crushed. Jeff Bezos and team are going to just eat our lunch. But to get it right for the world and for America matters. Let's go just run through the fire. And we did. And with a couple of small exceptions, we did that in every case, and I think got to a place that is in the best tradition of American foreign policy and national security policy. And he's got different view on tariffs and trade. We could spend a lot of time talking about that. I don't share that view, but there's a rational argument to be made there. But if you step aside from that, we got to a place that looks as a execution matter pretty much in the Republican national security tradition.
You have a very interesting, I'm listening to you and thinking about how you're making your peace with all this. And you're very open, and much more so than any senior Republican I can think of, when you say, look, he has a different view on tariffs and trades than I do, but he's president and I'm not. And but you don't start. You don't do the Lindsey Graham thing where you don't fake a sudden conversion. You haven't summoned something. You're not on the road to Damascus. You're willing to say, look, I just disagree with him on this.
Yes, I don't know how else to roll, Fareed. I'll never forget. We were about 4 months in. And the history was that I campaigned really hard against President Trump in the primary for Senator Rubio. He was my guy. I'd known Marco. I was the first congressman to come out and support him. When I was nominated to be CI director out of the blue, I'd never met Donald Trump. When I was nominated out of the blue, I get confirmed, and I see him. It's about 4 minutes, and I walk in one day. He says, "Hey, somebody just showed me some video, and we had worked diligently to get that buried, and we're pretty effective." He says, "Somebody showed me this video of you in Wichita, Kansas, and you crushed me." And I said, "Mr. President, just so you know, I'm going to work just as hard for you as I did against you." Right? You can count on me to be that same a-hole I was that day on your behalf. And that was my task, Fareed, right? The task wasn't to agree with him. It was to make my case, win more than my fair share, never violate any principle, never break the law, never do anything that I thought was indecent or immoral, or ask my team to do anything that I thought was indecent or immoral, whether it's at the agency or at the State Department. And then once the path was set, whether I'd won the debate or not, to go just viciously try to execute that. And then, in the aftermath, when people ask, "Did you agree with that?" I'm like, not my place to say necessarily, but when I get asked about pure policy, so I don't talk about debates in the Situation Room, but when they ask me about pure policy, what do you think? I tell them how I think about the world.
So imagine you're in the Oval Office, Donald Trump is president. It has gotten to the point where there has to be some kind of negotiation about Ukraine. The border at this point is, roughly where it is now. There's a stalemate. What would you advise him about how to deal with Putin? You've met him, you've studied him. What would you say? How should he approach Putin?
Well, first thing I would remind everybody there is that the Ukrainian leadership gets a big say in how this proceeds. So while we will be an important player there, right? You can see today we're controlling and throttling what the Ukrainians can do. So Ukraine doesn't have pure autonomy, but of course we don't have pure agency over them either, and ought not have pure agency over them. So I would remind everybody that we have to do this in a way that is coordinated with them and with our European friends and partners as well. Second, I would have developed a theory of the case how to be cost imposing on Putin himself, on the leadership, the Russian leadership. Absent that, he's as pragmatic as Donald Trump in that sense. He is performing a cost-benefit analysis in his own he's got his own calculator about how he values different things and political risk inside his own country. If he sits where he sits today, where today the benefit of continuing this aggression exceeds the cost, then I'm not sure. It looks like Minsk, right? It looks like this silly set of gatherings where everybody throws their hands up and meets once a quarter, every 6 months, and says, "Oh my gosh, we made progress today. We didn't throw anything at each other." In the end, you have to. And I saw this, and this isn't just true for him. For Putin, they're doing their own math, and you have to make sure that their math comes up with a solution for a negotiated outcome that is adequate for what it is we want. I'd say this last thing about this. There's all this thinking about what's in Vladimir Putin's head. It is damn easy to tell. Right, because you only need to see the actions that he takes, not what he tweets. I don't even know if he has Twitter account anymore. Not what he says when he holds a press conference, or that's all theater too. What you have to look at is what are the actions he's actually taking. Is he prepared to actually go conscript another 500,000 Russian soldiers? Is he prepared to suffer sanctions that are actually serious and enforced? These are things one can measure and identify. You need not guess, because speculate. I get it. I was a CI guy. In theory, we would know what Vladimir Putin's thinking every day. The reality is the best way to tell what someone's thinking is what they do this morning.
So when he says that if the United States were to give Ukraine permission to strike missile bases inside Russia, launching pads for drones, this would be a major escalation, and it would put NATO and Russia at war with one another, implying, therefore, that he would then start striking NATO. Yeah. You think it's a bluff?
We should take it seriously. I have not seen the intelligence that sits behind this. I'm sure some have. The ambassador may well have seen it, so they may know more than me. I'm happy to acknowledge that. We should test the case. We should press, and by the way, we should have pressed 2.5 years ago on this very matter. We would have been further. The last thing I'll say about that is, even if you're not prepared, and this is probably by the by in terms of 2.5 years in, you should spend a lot less time talking about the things you won't do and your fear of escalation. So the words here do matter. The perception matters. You should leave doubt in the world's mind about the things you might do and might not do, and speak about the things you are doing. Spend all your time broadcasting. We're sharing intelligence, whatever it is that we may be doing, and 0% of your time talking about the things you won't do, certainly talking about them publicly. We fell into that trap on a couple of occasions as well, and it just restricts your freedom of movement, because once you said you won't do it, it's a real mess to get back from. So focus forward on the things that you are all doing together and leave a lot of doubt. By the way, I was the enormous beneficiary of that with Donald Trump. Nobody knew him. Every world leader's met Joe Biden for 40 years, right? None of these folks know Donald Trump. So I'd walk in as Secretary of State, and the first thing some prime minister or president would do is they'd say, "Come here. Tell me about this guy." And then I would get to tell them whatever I chose. Always truthful, but emphasizing the things that I thought helped our cause. And that ambiguity, that absence of transparency about how he thought about the world and what risks he was actually prepared to take was a useful tool for his Secretary of State.
Nixon used to tell Kissinger, tell them Nixon is a madman.
I've read this. I didn't go quite that far, but CNN did, so it's all good.
But in a way, what you're saying is a version of Victor's point in, I thought, his very important opening speech, where he said, we talk too much about the dangers of escalation.
Yeah, I think
the one danger we should be talking about is of Russian victory, not of escalation.
Yes, I think that's right, Fareed. Yeah.
What about a second important issue with Putin? So in those negotiations that I think at some point will happen, what Putin will really want is something Ukraine can't deliver, only Washington can deliver, which is a relaxation of sanctions. What would be in your head, how would you think about that issue? Because that's ultimately my guess is that's the biggest leverage here is going to be those sanctions. What would you say about relaxing them?
It's a very difficult problem. It's a very difficult thing to unwind. It's especially difficult to do given the horrors that have been inflicted on civilians. The fact that he's now an indicted war criminal. This is what world leader is going to go sit and negotiate sanctions resolutions with the existing Russian leadership? This is a very hard problem set. It's why I think that's what Putin will ultimately demand. And this is a hard pill for folks to swallow, but I always come back to history. And, we're now great partners with Vietnamese. They killed 50,000 Americans. In the aftermath of World War II, we all found a way to go rebuild Germany and Japan. And we spend an enormous amount of taxpayer money, U.S. taxpayer money, to do each of those two things. Hard to stomach and imperative to do. And over some period of time, my guess is we will all find we'll find the stomach to do that as well. And to put that back, I'll give you one wrinkle that I think about how one might find a more, what's the right word? It's not palatable, but a fill-up that would say, great, fine, you can begin to move your energy in the global marketplace. We want two things. We want to make sure that you do this in a way that the pipeline that runs through here is protected and we have surety. I think there's a way to do that. And second, we need you to disconnect from the Chinese Communist Party, fundamentally, something that has increased and grown in the last 2.5 years. So we would get something that not only benefited us in the conflict between Russia and Europe, but benefit all of us in the years ahead in terms of unpacking, undoing, bringing back to something that would be very helpful. And I think that's also interesting, Fareed, because it will be absolutely interesting to see how Xi Jinping participates in these negotiations as well. We think about this as Ukraine and Russia with Europe and the United States over their shoulder. I assure you, Vladimir Putin is going to have the Chinese sitting over his shoulder as well, and we ought to crush them. We ought to make that, it's not choose, but we should make him remember we're going to press also. We're not going to give a free pass to what he's doing with the Chinese Communist Party either. So just another fill-up, another way to think about how you would gain some strategic leverage in the conversation.
What about the other part of that dyad, the Chinese? Because in some ways, Russia is a spoiler state. It benefits from international tension. Price of oil goes up, price of natural gas goes up, price of coal. It is a kind of state that thrives on a certain amount of that kind of thing. Iran being the same. The Chinese are different. They have grown rich in an integrated world. They need Western markets. Is there a way to go to the Chinese and drive a wedge on the other side?
I think so. Having said that, my experience with the Chinese leadership was that it was very difficult to do because they had I'll describe it as by the time we got into COVID, they had deprioritized their economic security for their hegemonic intentions. And so they were no longer as interested. They were willing to take a lot of economic risk, pain. You see it with what they've done to some of their senior business leaders. They were willing to take a lot of that economic pain in exchange for being able to continue to, sow strife in the Himalayas by going after the Indians and ram Philippine Coast Guard vessels off the atolls. And we were never able, we got our phase 1 trade deal done, but we were never really able to say, look, let's just get this economic piece of this right. This is in our both best interests. And so that level of economic tethering began to unravel. And a last thought on this one is, you have Republicans who talk about decoupling, and this is relevant to this conversation about how Ukraine settles out with Russia. Talk about decoupling. I don't believe it's possible to do, But if decoupling were to take place, and in some sense it's a continuum, it will most likely happen not because of a action that's taken in the U.S. Congress, but because of something that the Politburo Standing Committee does. I think Xi Jinping is preparing for decoupling himself, and not partly as a defensive measure, but mostly in preparation for the leverage that will provide to him when he moves to achieve his ultimate objective, a near-term objective, which is Taiwan coming under the political control of his country. And so I think he believes if he gets to near sustainability, deconnectedness, directionally, he thinks when he begins to actually tighten the screws on Taiwan, he'll have a lot more space and will fold more quickly. The West will fold more quickly.
You think he's looking at Russia's, the effect of the sanctions on Russia and thinking, will we be able to withstand a similar set of sanctions?
Yeah, I do think he's looking at it. And Fareed, I would guess he's thinking we can. I think he would say the evidence of the last 2.5 years would signal to him we'll have our moments. There'll be things that are difficult, but our economy, the Americans are terrified of sanctioning Chinese banks. That has proven true these last 2.5 years. We were loath to do it as well. There's nothing like the Secretary of State walking into the Secretary of Treasury and saying, "Hey, I got this great idea. We're going to go sanction these 4 Chinese banks." And he says, "Young man, I don't think you understand how global capital flows work." And so I think he sees the power of Chinese capital as a bulwark against true sanctions that would impact his economy in a material way.
Finally, Mike, you've been in Ukraine now for a couple of days. You've been talking to a lot of people. Give us some sense of your impressions. What are you going to go back with if Donald Trump were to call you and say, "Hey, Mike, I hear you were in Ukraine"? What's the takeaway you might give him?
I hope he does, and I'd be happy to go to Bedminster, Mar-a-Lago, and see him, and tell him the story. The story I'd probably start with is I would start with the story of this morning. I was with several dozen young kids, amazing young people who have their whole life in front of them. I'm an old man. These were young people, and they're talented, smart, aggressive, all of the things that you would want, and importantly, committed to their own country and its success. And these aren't people that you worry about corruption. These aren't people where you're worried about them falling the wrong way. These are people who are dedicated to getting a good outcome. And I'll remind him that they have no sense of ever being part of the Soviet Union. When Putin says to them, there's this history, and they're like, what? Right? Not even in many cases, their parents wouldn't have known that, at least in all but their early years. I want to remind him that the good people of Ukraine are prepared to do a lot that is in America's best interest, and we have this responsibility for America. Let's end where we began. To put America first, it's in our best interest to make sure that we get this right.
Mike Pompeo, pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, my friend.